This is a response to Once Forgiven Now Free's video, Evolution, What You Won't Learn in Public School, Homology. Hello, Matt. It's been a long time since Holy Hallucinations 20 and 21, and an awful lot of putrid sewage has since seeped down the gutter of creationist sophistry. I'd long decided to ignore you for 3 reasons. First, because of my exasperation at your seemingly eldritch ability to make response videos that pretended to address my criticisms while simultaneously ignoring the vast majority of them, and instead producing irrelevancies faster than an overrated rabbi feverishly pulling endless red herrings from a basket. Secondly, because I know from past experience that you'd almost certainly leap onto any opportunity for some undeserved attention, like that sad kid in the playground who'll eat a dog turd for a bet because he thinks it'll make him more popular. And thirdly, because I wasn't inclined to further fuel your pathetic martyr complex, as you appear to develop an impressively tumescent boner whenever provided with the opportunity to convince yourself that you're suffering for Jesus. I was, however, contacted by a subscriber who pointed out this offering of yours, and while viewing it I was quite astounded to find that despite the seeming impossibility, you actually had managed to get stupider and more dishonest in my absence. As a result, I couldn't bring myself to let this atrocity slide and felt obliged to take the time to point out some of your infuriatingly smug shitbaggery. So with that said, let's get down to business. I suspect that the prolonged hiatus since our last encounter has ameliorated the dilation somewhat, so while I play the first clip, you might want to take the time to liberally apply some petrolatum before assuming the customary position.
Hello and welcome to the Once Forgiven Now Free YouTube channel, where we take the claims of evolution and we examine them with critical thinking.
Nice start, Matt. Good one. Of course, I realize that you meant this for the like-minded simpletons whose ignorance you're bent on dragging down to your level, but I'm afraid that the material on your channel provides indisputable evidence that, like all creationists, you're as capable of thinking as Ian Juby is of walking past a Wendy's without stopping to root around in the dumpster. And as for those pitiful clusters of malformed, shriveled neurons inside your skull doing their thing critically, don't you find it strange that you seem to think yourself eminently capable of doing so whenever something doesn't fit with your pre-existing psychosis, and yet are demonstrably incapable of doing the same when it comes to figuring out why modern science is so much better at explaining the natural world than were an ancient group of inbred camel diddlers?
In this episode, we'll be studying homology and showing how high school biology textbooks are actually committing logical fallacies to support evolution.
Seriously, Matt? Under normal circumstances, I'd put this down to being just an inexcusably careless choice of words, but since I'm more than aware of your self-imposed dumb fuckery, I suspect that you might actually have meant it. Do you really think that high school biology textbooks are intended to support evolutionary theory? Because it really would take a special kind of bollock-brained simpleton to think that such rudimentary didactic texts aimed at explaining the most basic of concepts in the simplest of terms are anything more than broad-brush descriptions of the current scientific consensus. In the reality that exists outside your miserably addled mental faculties, of course, the science these books are introducing is actually supported by a veritable ocean of highly technical papers containing meticulously recorded experimental and observational data and the provisional inductive conclusions that inevitably stem from them. It's just a small handful of these conclusions, a tiny soupçon of the data that underpin them that are being presented in these primers, and then only after dilution to sufficient simplicity so that they can be understood by both schoolchildren and irredeemable retards. So it's telling, Matt, that as you wage your impotent little war against modern science, you choose not to use the actual source material or even college-level texts. Is it because you're too indolent to produce or too stupid to comprehend them, I wonder? Whatever the reason, you instead opt to tread the road inevitably taken by the despicably dishonest bastard and cover your contempt for intellectual rigor by feigning that the depiction of evolutionary biology you're attacking is the real thing and not a vastly simplified pastiche. In the psychedelic haze induced by your overzealous Bible thumping, this behavior might seem reasonable to you. But to normal people who've actually been educated in the fields you love to smugly crap in, you look like a particularly egocentric and overconfident kindergartner who thinks he can legitimately criticize Ernest Hemingway just because he's learnt his A-B-fucking-C's.
Let's start off with the textbook Modern Biology, which has a section on the evidence for evolution. It states that similar features that originated in a shared ancestor are described as homologous. We can then look at the sketch they give us and see that the penguin, the alligator, the bats, and humans, they all have similar bone structures. First, there's a green one, and then there's a purple one and a pink one. Then there's a little blue one. I mean, the similarities are just overwhelming, right? And if we look to the right, we see that the bones even have the same names. Pretty amazing, huh? Obviously, they're similar because they're related, right?
So let's get this straight, Matt. You allege you're an engineer and so presumably have had very little, if any, graduate education in biology, formal training in comparative anatomy, or actual experience of dissecting these animals to look at these fucking structures as opposed to smirking self-importantly at them in your little picture book. With this in mind, it seems your argument here is that based on this impressive academic pedigree, you feel your personal incredulity at these bone similarities trumps the expert opinion of people who've spent lifetimes studying subjects you've avoided like the plague. So while everyone should always be open to the possibility that such experts might be wrong, it should take a lot more than the say-so of an uneducated, jumped-up little cocksucker to persuade them. That kind of argumentation might be good enough for scripturally lobotomized tards like you, but I and many others tend not to lend very much credence to the spurious inanities burbled by random internet imbeciles. So unless you're prepared to state concisely and precisely why the relative numbers, articulations, juxtapositions, symmetries and geometries of these bones are not overwhelmingly similar, you can take your worthless opinion and use it to give yourself some much-needed sphincter size.
Now, any rational person needs to stop here and notice that similarities, or homology, doesn't prove that they evolved from a common ancestor. It just proves that they're similar.
Well, no shit, Matt. Welcome to the fucking obvious. Of course, in isolation, although curious, that might well be the best conclusion that such similarities would warrant. However, the thing your penetrating insight here neglects to consider is that these patterns of homology are just one aspect of an immense body of evidence from multiple independent fields of study that all converge on a single inference that can be made with an astounding level of statistical confidence, that is, common descent. Now, I perused the book you're wiping with your arse and found that it does briefly outline some of these evidential lines, so you've no excuse for this omission. Isn't it strange that you neglected to mention them and only discussed morphological similarity in vacuo? It's almost as if you deliberately misinterpreted the breadth and concordance of the evidence used to reach that conclusion, and tried to deceptively imply that this inference is wholly unjustified because it's based on a single set of observations. Of course, only a reprehensibly dishonest streak of vile filth would be so deliberately misleading, so I'll assume that such details escaped your notice because of either your profound cognitive impairment or an unrecognized need for a reassessment of your corrective lens prescription. I should also add in the full 6 pages it dedicates to the evidence, this book you claim is used to support evolution barely even touches upon the almost incontrovertible genetic data. None of this detracts Matt from the impression of you as a little boy on the short bus who's just finished thumbing his way through his dad's copy of Playboy and thinks that qualifies him to be a gynecologist. It's also fascinating that you fully admit to the reality of these homologies here, whereas moments earlier you were sneering at their overwhelming similarity. What was the point of that earlier display of fatuous condescension, Matt? Could it be that the deafening reverberation of your cognitive dissonance made it difficult for even you to dismiss them entirely, and so instead you settle for minimizing them in the hope that this might somehow seal the gaping holes in your miserably tattered worldview? I'm not a psychologist, so I couldn't say for sure, but I'm willing to bet both testicles that if one ever got you on the couch, he'd get a fucking thick book out of you, and quite possibly a trilogy. And as for your use of the word proof, Well, you seem to be unaware that grown-ups realize that the goal of science is to develop ever more refined descriptive models of reality that are consistent with empirical observation, resistant to falsification, and that provide specific predictive and explanatory power. The success of this approach is evidenced by our modern technology that can now cure diseases once thought to be caused by the whims of capricious preternatural spectres, and that allow even the most shit-brained of simpletons to discharge the effluent slopping around between their ears across the world at the click of a mouse. In reality, the only people who think science does or should produce absolute epistemic certainty are children and mentally subnormal gibbons. Oh, and creationists.
After all, two computer programs may have some similar code, but that doesn't prove that they evolved by a blind random process. They were still both intelligently designed.
Of course, Matt, while I admit that Microsoft is particularly adept at producing computer programs spectacularly well suited to fucking their users, they haven't yet created any that can fuck each other, much less reproduce with variation. And while we can teach people how to program, we know how to use copy and paste functions, and have observed people designing and building keyboards, we've yet to record a single verifiable instance of an ephemeral supracosmic transdimensional pixie inserting a femur into a donkey's arse. Thus your analogy's about as relevant to biology as your education's been to your enlightenment. Of course you know this because I've vigorously stuffed this particularly wretched canard up you arsewardly before, and yet here you are in true creationist style, ignoring the flaws in your dismal arguments and continuing to spew them like a busted sewer line after Ian Juby just flushed. In any case, why is it, Matt, that we no longer see monumental dumbfucks claiming that the fact that all snowflakes are hexagonal means there's a transcendental molecular carpenter in the sky, knocking each one up with his celestial toolkit? Why do they never claim that the consistency of the colours of the rainbow means that the carpenter also has access to a box of Crayolas? Could it be that it's because our knowledge of physical chemistry and quantum physics allows us to explain these phenomena without recourse to cosmic crafters, and that anyone resorting to their evocation would be dismissed as a backward, uneducated oaf? Because you see, Matt, we also have perfectly reasonable physical explanations of the diversity of life on this planet, and the only people who refuse to lend them credence are those who are too lazy, biased, or stupid to examine the evidence honestly, or those who remain deliberately ignorant of it because they cannot stand the thought of having the cherished safety blanket of their literal scriptural interpretations disappear in a puff of evidence.
So that's the first thing we need to notice if we want to think logically about this. If someone claims that similarities are evidence of common ancestry, there's a hidden assumption in there. The conclusion of common ancestry does not logically follow. That's why it's important to remember the difference between the facts and the interpretation of the facts.
So there you go again, Matt, greasily implying that the conclusion of common ancestry is based solely on morphology. This pretense is both inaccurate and reprehensibly dishonest, but I know from past exchanges that you can't be shamed by your repugnant behavior because you're incapable of even recognizing it. Not only did Thunderfoot once point out that you reneged on your promise of a civilized discussion with atheists faster than Ian Juby waddling across a McDonald's parking lot, but I've seen you obdurately and vociferously deny using a straw man even after indisputable evidence of its existence was methodically crammed up your arse using words of one syllable. Once again, the inference of common ancestry is not based on morphological similarity alone, but on a vast, internally consistent and exquisitely concordant body of well-documented and verifiable facts.
Now here's where the textbook shoots itself in the foot. Here it states that sometimes organisms that appear to be very similar, such as a shark and a porpoise, are not closely related at all. Wait, isn't that the exact opposite of what they just said? See, what they're basically saying is, similarities are evidence of common ancestry, except for when similarities are not due to common ancestry.
I hate to inform you, Matt, but the only person shooting themselves in the foot here is you. And after pulling the trigger, it appears you've also put said foot in your mouth so far that your tattered tarsi have emerged through your anal aperture. And that's because you seem to have attached absolutely no significance to the word appear. You see, the reason the authors used the words appear to be and not the word are wasn't because they were suffering from verbal diarrhea, but because they were indicating that the similarities are only superficial and may at first glance seem like similarities to laymen. You know, to people like high school students and fatuous, fundy fucktards. Believe it or not, Matt, biologists have actually looked inside sharks and porpoises and noted thousands of differences that belie their facile resemblance, and these are just as important as similarities in unraveling their evolutionary heritage. It seems to me, Matt, that you assume that scientists' thought processes are just as facile as yours and that, like you, they make vapid pronouncements based on little or no investigation at all. In fact, I find it quite ironic because the kind of reasoning you use here is, I'm sure, the same kind that led a certain ancient tribe of goat fondlers to conclude that bats are birds, whales are fish, and that the world was created in 6 days by an invisible pan-dimensional leprechaun. It seems that some things don't change. So with this in mind, what you should have said in your paraphrase was, similarities are evidence of common ancestry except when similarities are not really similarities but are mistaken for them by overconfident, ignorant, dim-witted boobs.
So again, we're told that similarities are evidence of common ancestry. But sometimes it's not. So, how do you know if it's due to common ancestry or not? Well, apparently, we have to presuppose an evolutionary tree of life. If similar animals are closely related, then they call it homology. And if they aren't, then they call it convergent evolution. So, if you're wondering what a circular argument is, here's a great example.
It might have been a great example if you hadn't fished it proudly whole cloth from the sweaty cleft between your pallid buttocks. You see, Matt, your astounding ignorance and intellectual ineptitude aren't good substitutes for actually knowing something about the field of science you apparently think you're discrediting with your feckless twaddle. I'll now forestall any attempts by your fellow low-browed knuckle-draggers to use my entirely justified insults to accuse me of ad hominem argumentation by establishing exactly why your spurious assertion is no more than a particularly malodorous example of creationist oral flatulence. This will concomitantly demonstrate that my impugnation of your mental faculties is not an instance of poisoning the well, but rather an uncannily accurate description of readily observable physical reality. The presupposed evolutionary tree of life you refer to in your uniquely smug superciliousness is about as presupposed as William Lane Craig is a decent and honourable human being. Modern cladistic analysis classifies living creatures using shared derived characteristics, be they morphological or molecular. The process is entirely objective to the point that it can be encoded into mathematical algorithms that generate the most parsimonious phylogenies by minimizing the number of character changes across the entire tree. It is not conducted in the same way as creation research, that is, by the anal extrusion of ad hoc rationalizations, misinformation, and downright fucking lies. As an example, I generated a phylogeny using the freeware package Philip using 11 taxa and 13 characters and the mix algorithm, and produced 3 very similar trees. The parsimony of each, as indicated by the total number of steps or changes in characters required to produce them, was 14, only one more than the 13 supplied, the reason being that one character, that is, wings, appears both in flies and birds and so required 2 appearances of that character in the phylogeny. Interestingly, all 3 trees group birds with vertebrates and flies with insects and not vice versa. That's because the appearance of one shared characteristic, that is wings, doesn't override the larger number of similarities and differences that birds have with tetrapods and flies with arthropods. So to answer you, that's how educated people with a respect for knowledge know whether a trait is most likely a homoplazy caused by convergent evolution. I hope this explains why your assertion of circularity holds as much water as a gerbil's bladder, and that this information will prevent you from making a complete arse splat of yourself again in public by asking this particularly ignorant and uninformed question. That said, I know of course that this disingenuous query was actually just a limp rhetorical device, as it's clear that you have no interest in learning anything about evolution beyond reading repugnant creationist rags to ferret out new repulsive lies to tell about it. That's because all you want is to cling onto your puerile creation fable as firmly as Bible-thumping wingnut keeps his nose lodged up Seitan Bruggenkate's arsehole. Thus, to further expose the clumsy ham-fisted cack you're peddling and that you've convinced yourself passes for argumentation, I also constructed phylogenies using 13 randomly assigned characteristics to 11 fictional cars, which even a useless dingleberry like you would agree are not generated by replication with variation and selection. And guess what? I got 4 phylogenies that each required a full 23 steps to construct, so that in effect characters were jumping around as frequently as a greasy apologist assiduously shifting goalposts as if his life depended on it. I hope that this now demonstrates that such trees are constructed by people interested in discovering and understanding the patterns found in nature, and not by self-deluded fucktards desperate to impose their ludicrous fantasies onto it. You see, Matt, I've lost count of the number of times I've had borderline retards like you tell me that phylogenies are meaningless because everything can be classified in a nested hierarchy, and yet when told that only evolved systems such as life and languages could be objectively, and that statistical tools exist to measure the extent of phylogenetic signals and so give confidence intervals as to the likelihood of any given hierarchical hypothesis, I've unerringly been met by the proverbial stare of the village idiot that hasn't the capacity to pull his finger from his nostril or stop drooling into his crotch. What you imbeciles seem to think is that everyone is as stupid as you are, and that no one has ever considered alternative interpretations of the empirical data nor tested them to determine their veracity, perhaps because you're unable to comprehend that someone might be interested in discovering the actual truth rather than clinging to their own preconceptions like a bloated tick onto a dog's ring piece. Well, I regret to inform you, Matt, that the world does actually contain intellectually honest people. You may have heard of them. They're called scientists. And if you ever feel like acting like one, I suggest you stop making arguments out of your own limitless ignorance, stop reading nothing but shit-stained creationist screeds, and instead try a book on Cladistics. You might then try and prove your point by demonstrating mathematically that statistically significant nested hierarchies can be formed by something other than bifurcating evolutionary processes. But I'm not holding my breath, partly because it seems somewhat unlikely that something that has eluded some of the sharpest minds of our species could be discovered by a dishonest dumbfuck like you, and partly because it's so much easier for you to just stand up in public and spout horse shit as if you were a front runner in the Kentucky Derby.
Now, some evolutionists hope that genetics would clear up this problem, since perhaps homologous structures would develop in similar ways. Well, Sir Gavin de Beer, an evolutionist, wrote a book titled Homology, an Unsolved Problem. Here's what he has to say. Because homology implies community of descent from a common ancestor, it might be thought that genetics would provide the key to the problem of homology. This is where the worst shock of all is encountered. Characters controlled by identical genes are not necessarily homologous, and homologous structures need not be controlled by identical genes. Sounds like a failed argument for evolution, yet it's still in the textbook.
Have you considered that it sounds like homology is a failed argument for evolution to you because you're an ignorant buffoon who's completely uneducated in the areas he's reportedly debunking and yet lacks the humility to recognize his monumental deficiencies? It's my understanding that your special friend Jesus allegedly had something to say about the meek and what they had coming to them. And if that's the case, then I can only imagine that when it comes time for the reading of the will, Matt, all you're in line for is a coupon for a quarter-pounder at McDonald's. So what you neglected to mention is that De Beer's book was written in 1971 and wasn't a book but a 16-page pamphlet. Furthermore, it appears to be written for an audience well below the college level, exposing an interesting emergent pattern with regard to your choice of scientific material. I know this because despite considerable difficulty I managed to secure a copy that I could read for myself, and would bet both bollocks that you haven't done the same and instead are just plagiarizing some shitty claim you read on a piece of creationist toilet paper and are passing off as your own. As for De Beer's problem, it appears it was entirely based on a Drosophila breeding experiment where a recessive mutation that produced eyeless flies occasionally reverted in an inbred population, while mating of such progeny back into the wild-type stock restored the eyeless phenotype, suggesting that the original function had been restored by an unrelated, presumably non-homologous gene. I have to confess that I was somewhat confused when I read this because it seemed that De Beer had completely overlooked the phenomenon of suppressor mutations, where a second mutation in a different protein compensates for the original defect and which entirely explains De Beer's non-existent dilemma. In fact, I later discovered an article in the National Center for Science Education's Creation Evolution journal pointing out the exact same flaw in this argument. I was surprised at first that De Beer, at the time an emeritus professor of embryology, had overlooked a basic mechanism taught to all undergraduates, but then remembered that he produced this pamphlet a full 6 years before Fred Sanger published his method for sequencing DNA, and so could be excused as the phenomenon had probably not been discovered. Indeed, the same could be said for some of the other alleged problems he discusses in that tract, which have since been elegantly explained after the advent of modern molecular biological techniques. You would do yourself a great favour, Matt, if you took the time to read Sean Carroll's delightful book, Endless Forms Most Beautiful, which explains how elegantly genetics and embryology are integrated, instead of polluting your mediocre mind with the effluent being discharged by the creationist brothels you seem to have such a penchant for patronising. Had you done something like that before making this complete train wreck of a video, you might have saved yourself the embarrassment of proving yourself to be such an unmitigated dildo. In any case, before we continue, I just wanted to point out that you appear to think that 40-year-old material should be unquestioningly regarded as representative of current scientific consensus, which I suppose isn't so surprising, as you also appear to think that the semi-demented scribblings of unidentified ancient camel humpers are absolutely inerrant and contain unalterable truths about physical reality. But unlike you, Matt, science isn't stuck with accepting the status quo as sacrosanct, and instead changes constantly to refine its models and produce ever more accurate representations of reality, leaving you and your miserable ilk to rot in the dark ages with your primitive and laughable superstitions.
Let's end off with a quote from the atheist philosopher Michael Ruse. "Evolution is a religion. This was true of evolution in the beginning, and it is true of evolution still today." Hey, I'm not the one who said it.
You might not have said it, Matt, but as we'll see, you certainly mined it as enthusiastically as a perverted dwarf clambering his way up Snow White's thigh. Now, I ignored some of the intervening material because you were merely reiterating your incredulity born of your unique mixture of self-imposed ignorance, arrogance, and cerebral mediocrity as to your hallucinogenic perception of an incongruence between synapomorphies and homoplasies, which I've already inserted from whence they came. Instead, I jumped straight to this non sequitur of a coda which I suppose you couldn't resist attaching to the arse end of this videographic turd in order to project your superstitions onto your detractors. The problem though, Matt, is that it took me less than 20 seconds on the Google machine to find Dr. Ruse explaining the subtleties of his position, which is somewhat at odds with this grotesque strawman that you extracted from the redolent guano mines that you seem to so relish revelling in. It's telling because had you read what I read, even you, with your almost supernatural lack of self-awareness, might have felt a pang of guilt or embarrassment at what you just said. But since it's evident that you don't give one single flying fuck about the truth if it contradicts your delusions, I can imagine that you never really gave a shit about what Dr. Ruse was trying to say, and instead leapt onto a quote that you read in some obscene little shitpit as eagerly as if it were Jesus sitting in an oil wrestling ring holding a tub of lube. For the record, Ruse was sharing his opinion that modern scientific naturalism, including evolutionary theory, is beginning to supplant deep-seated sociological and psychological human needs that had previously been sated by more primitive and less rational explanations of the world around us. This isn't, of course, quite the same thing as your laughable attempt to equivocate established science with your particular kind of childish, feeble appeals to spectral juju, but I suppose I shouldn't be surprised since it's evident that contemptible little fuckers like you wouldn't know what context and nuance were if they kicked you in the balls from a running start. Well, I suppose that covers it, Matt. But by way of clarification, the purpose of this video wasn't to change your mind, which despite your previous disingenuous claims to the contrary, wouldn't happen even if Lord Vishnu himself descended from the sky and gave you a rim job. Instead, my intent was to give you the dose of ridicule and derision you deserve. And while many might feel that this has been an exercise in futility, and they may well have a point, I do think it worthwhile to occasionally show up stupidity and dishonesty for what it is in the hope that it may make others think twice before trying to further promulgate such inanities, or that it may jolt some poor soul trapped in the same mindset as you to at least think again. At the very least, I'll consider my time well spent if I provided others with a few laughs at your expense, or if I've shown a sane Christian or two what a subset of certifiable loons are doing and saying in the name of their religion. Because from where I'm standing it seems quite clear that if your God needs to be defended with the kind of outright lies and mind-numbing banality that you proudly excreted into your video, then he can't be much of a God at all now. Can he?